Well, good evening, everyone, and terrific to see you all here. This is the beginning of yet another season of Boat Talks. 20-odd years they've been going now. So some of you, no doubt, were at the first one. So yeah, 20th season, so it's tremendous. And it's really, really good to be starting it with this rather special evening, where we are hoping to obviously be engrossed in the talk and the presentation, but at the same time raising some money for a very worthwhile cause and charity based out in Ukraine. So tonight's talk is focused mainly on the work that Mhairi has been doing in Ukraine, but there'll be other elements as well. We're really pleased and privileged, really, to have Mhairi with us tonight to be our opening speaker. I don't know, I will embarrass her by saying that she's a very remarkable person. Having given up a job working in Paris for the Australian government, gives that all up and takes herself off to Cairo to learn Arabic so that she could extend her opportunities, and then gets a job with the Halo Trust, which I'm sure you'll be familiar, based in Dumfries, clearing landmines from dangerous parts of the world. And so Mhairi was working with the Trust for a number of years in a number of different locations, which she'll no doubt tell us more about, before going to Ukraine in order to help clear mines from an invasion that Russia perpetrated in 2014. But then, as we all know, the world changed, and that's what I suspect we'll hear a lot more about tonight. So, driven up from south of Perth, Stanley Mills this afternoon, driving back there so she can get back to London tomorrow morning. I think it's fantastic that she squeezed us into that itinerary. So thank you so much for coming.
Thank you, Mike. It's a little bit daunting. A few familiar faces in the audience, but it's with great pleasure that I'm back here in Boatgarten. Firstly, thank you to Mike and Tim for inviting me along here this evening, and to Alan particularly for helping with the tech to get us started. It's actually my first time here in the Boat Community Hall, but I've been coming to Boat for as long as I can remember, long before this building. Well, I still see it as the new Village Hall, but it's always a pleasure to be back in Boatgarten. In autumn of 2021, I took up a position as the country director for the international mine clearance charity, the Halo Trust in Ukraine. I was based between Kramatorsk and Kyiv, and my job, or at least how it was sold to me at the time, was to oversee a mine clearance program, clearing up, as Mike said, from the 2014 conflict. I had 430 staff in the Donbass, an annual budget of approximately $8 million. And it was a steady, several-year-old program, steady operations, but some management, HR, cultural issues. So I'd been brought in to provide a bit of progressive, dynamic leadership whilst continuing to navigate a fairly complex political environment and maintain the viability of Halo's work in Ukraine. Yes, there was an aggressive neighbour to the east, but the security situation at that time was relatively stable, I was told, or at least told by my employer and most of the international community at the time. Instead, in February 2022, I find myself at the epicenter of the biggest conflict facing Europe since World War II, following Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. I led an evacuation of staff, and then was back into Ukraine less than a month later, first to Lviv and then to Kyiv in early April, following the rapid Russian retreat, and was overseeing the restart of Halo's operations. And by May, we were commencing mine clearance operations again in the outskirts of Kyiv, where Russia had established positions and brought havoc, devastation, and immense human suffering. By the time I left the role in March of this year, I had over 700 staff, conducting mine clearance across Ukraine in Kyiv region, Mykolaiv, Kherson, Kharkiv, with a budget of $80 million and growing. Now, if you told me 6 months prior to taking on that job, that's what I'd end up doing, I probably wouldn't have believed you, and I probably wouldn't have accepted the job knowing what was ahead. However, it has been an experience that has shaped and changed me quite considerably, and I'm pleased, I'm really glad to be able to share some of these experiences with this engaged audience here this evening. I'll caveat that the period of January 2022 to March 2023, a lot of this is a bit of a blur for me. I'm still processing a lot. And in preparing for this evening, you know, it did remind me of a lot I'd forgotten or perhaps chosen to forget. I won't make any commentary on the state of the war in Ukraine, the geopolitics. I'm no analyst or geopolitical expert, and I'm sure there are people in the room far better read, far better placed than me to talk on those matters. And I also don't plan to talk too much about Halo's technical work. I may touch on it and happy to answer questions later. And I should caveat, I don't work for Halo anymore, so I'm not speaking in any official Halo capacity. But I plan over the next half hour or so to share some of my experiences from what I've seen from the ground, some of the challenges, some of the positive experiences of managing some truly remarkable people, incredibly resilient people facing the worst and in a country under invasion. I thought I might start, well, briefly go back a step and explain how on earth I ended up in Ukraine in November 2021. Mike alluded earlier to some of my work before Halo. I've not necessarily deliberately or consciously chosen a less trodden path. Subconsciously, perhaps, yes, but in my case, my somewhat non-linear career path had given me the privilege of working in some interesting places. And with Halo, it led me to working in some rather off the beaten track, challenging but very interesting places. So in 2018, I was working in Egypt, and I'd been had some experience in the defence, civil service. At the time, for my sins, I was assistant to the UK ambassador to Egypt, which was a somewhat thankless but nonetheless interesting job. But I was seeking some longer-term career, and I wanted to get my boots dirty, cut my teeth at some field work. And so at that point, I was accepted to join an international ops management training program with Halo. So Halo is a Scottish-based charity, but works in conflict and post-conflict countries in over 30 countries. And it seemed like the perfect fit. Mine Action is a funny world. It sort of straddles humanitarian, development spheres, security, defense, hard to categorize. So it really suited my somewhat non-linear, non-conformist approach to my career up to that point. And with my diplomatic defense background, my interest in security issues, it really seemed a great fit. So I embarked on a 6-month technical operational management training program. It was a pretty tough course, something of a military culture in Halo as an organization. And so I started in Cambodia, clearing landmines. Training took me to Somaliland, and then here in Abkhazia, where I did explosive ordnance disposal training. What you see here is the fun part of mine clearance, which constitutes about 5% of it. The rest can be very slow, painstaking work, actually seeking out and finding explosive hazards to then remove them. I've got a slight grimace and smile in this picture, but I think I was close to wetting my pants there as I was about to lay the charge for a bulk demolition of about 1/2 ton of explosives. And yes, I had the privilege of being trained by some excellent, mostly ex-military bomb disposal experts. But all this was technical training, not with a view to me becoming the technical expert, but having an understanding of the operations before moving into more programmatic management roles on Halo's programs. So, as I said, this is the more fun part of the job. Towards the end, my work was a lot more desk-based, and most of my minefields ended up being political, both internal and external, rather than the actual physical minefields. some tough work in some tough places. This was my training in Somaliland. When I found this photo the other day, I thought I was channeling our late Queen Elizabeth with the sort of Balmoral look with the headscarf. That's actually a hijab, because I had to obviously go around wearing with my head covered. It's fine for driving. It's not so comfortable for actual demining, but that's what the women in Somaliland, and Halo recruits a lot of women there, have to do. But yes, this was again another fun part of the job. Driving around in old Land Rovers, and part of my training was learning to strip apart a Land Rover engine. Don't ask me now to this day how to do that. You know, learn by rote, learn the parts of the engine, but yeah, not necessarily long-term sustainable skills. But it was certainly a fun experience, albeit challenging. This is actually a colleague of mine who I trained with, Gabby. So we were two fairly feisty, feminist, red-headed women deployed with an all-male Somalilander survey and EOD, explosive ordnance disposal team. We were eager to learn. The team we were assigned to were very obliging and courteous, but some obvious cultural barriers. So when they were faced with these two quite feisty redheads, I don't think they knew what was coming. This was also Somaliland, but this is an example of Halo's work. Obviously, depends on the country context, the culture and living standards where Halo works, what deminers' accommodation was like. But this was a deminers' camp out in the desert of Somaliland. There's a slight World War II British colonial military vibe, and I have to say with Halo, there's an element of that in the historic culture of the organization. But yeah, again, you know, it was tough conditions in some tough places. From Somaliland, I then finished training, and then my first posting was in a place called Abkhazia. Now, before I joined Halo, I did not know that place existed, and most of my friends at the time said, "No, you've made that country up. You would not be alone," and not being sure where that is on the map. It's a little forgotten corner of the former Soviet Union, breakaway state sandwiched between Georgia and Russia, that suffered a short but very bloody war in the spill out from the breakup of the Soviet Union in 92, 93. Self-declared independence, but not recognized by Georgia or the international community. And a very difficult relationship with Russia, who recognized its independence in 2008 in return for a security guarantee. So this is a line of Russian tanks. I probably shouldn't have been taking this photo from the dashboard of my car, but this was every 3 months. It was essentially a changing of the guard, as the Russian military positions in Abkhazia, they changed around. You know, it was a new shift, and you saw rows and rows of military vehicles coming in to Abkhazia, which is also an incredibly beautiful spot. You see the backdrop of the Caucasus there, but we had tough work to do. So the work that I was involved in Abkhazia was less mine clearance and more clear up from a major unplanned explosion of a military ammunition store. So in 2018, it was an old Soviet legacy arms depot that had been hidden away near the hills, next to a village, next to a beautiful scenic tourist spot. The roof, two men were fixing the roof, smoking a cigarette. The roof caught fire, and they reckon about 500,000 items of explosive ordnance were in the depot. That all went boom, scattering, not all of it detonated, so scattering explosive debris, looking like this somewhat apocalyptic looking scene. So this was the task at hand in Abkhazia. And yeah, I had the privilege of working with a really brilliant local team managing this amazing team. Some very strong woman here, Sasha, who was trained to conduct clearance. And that's a big thing with Halo's work. It's providing job opportunities in places where often there aren't. And a few more of the team at work. This This task took a few years to complete. I was there overseeing it for about a year and a half. But yeah, one of the most scenic spots I've had the pleasure of working in, with the mountains in the backdrop. This was some of the team here. Yeah, as I said, men and women, and it was a big component of Halo's work, is ensuring equal opportunities. And so we had this individual here, Esma, who was previously trained as a journalist, but few opportunities, and saw this opportunity to learn and lead a team and help her country. Nastia here, who had a passion for engines, and we taught her how to drive an excavator and do mechanics. So that was work, but I should point out that it wasn't all hard work. I did get to see some pretty incredible spots, and this was a ski touring trip I did in Abkhazia, not a heavily frequented place, but yeah, some of the most incredible mountain scenery that I've ever encountered. Across the border/contested border boundary line into Georgia, what we would refer to as Tbilisi-controlled territory, we also had some work, and this was a task that I was overseeing in a place called Chontos in the hills, just near the boundary with South Ossetia. Now this was as a result of the 2008 conflict when between Russia and Georgia, and it was a Russian aircraft that was shot down with a full payload of 250 kilogram aircraft bombs, which you see on the right. So the pilot was killed, the plane crashed, pilot's killed, but in a pretty inconvenient spot to do any clearance. So this is up some steep hills in a very inaccessible area. Now the challenge there was it was proving security or a threat to locals in the area. And you often find in these types of environments, people go to quite extreme measures to make a bit of buck. There was some explosive harvesting going on, people with hacksaws trying to extract the explosive fill of these aircraft bombs. So there was a real need for us to conduct clearance. Not a particularly easy task, though, no less the geography, but also the politics of getting buy-in from both sides in a politically contested area. So a lot of my work at that time was engaging with diplomatic missions, EU monitoring mission, who had access to both sides, the South Ossetians, the Georgians, to ensure that we wouldn't find people hiding in trees on the other side of the boundary as we were about to do a demolition, which is what we did on the left-hand photo, digging big pits and using a remote winch to pull them into to do a controlled explosion. I should point out, so yeah, a lot of my work was project management and calling in some pretty awesome EOD technician experts to work out a clearance plan for, it was over 30, I think, of these aircraft bombs. Yeah, again, tough conditions. This was the camp. I think my boots perished in that fire, or they were a bit too close to the fire pit and had melted boots, but that was the team of Georgian men that we had employed to do this task. But again, all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy, as they say. And so weekends I was able to sneak off and do quite exciting things in Georgia. This was another ski touring trip to a different spot on the boundary with South Ossetia, to a monastery. You see the cross there. So yeah, challenging work, but some incredible opportunities along the way. From the Caucasus, this is not me, by the way, the Caucasus, I moved back to the Middle East, and I took up the role of country director for Halo's work in northwest Syria. Now, sadly, I never made it into northwest Syria, Idlib and northern Aleppo. Even now, very difficult for internationals to access for security concerns. So I did my work remote management, which, safer. I was sitting in air-conditioned offices in Amman, in Jordan, and also in Turkey, in Gaziantep. But very challenging work when the conditions and the humanitarian situation in northwest Syria is getting no better and is dire. And it's an unfortunate reality that there's donor fatigue, there's international media fatigue, and it's becoming a forgotten conflict in a way. But Halo's work was still going on, and so we were recruiting local teams. And this lady here, you see, we trained up to do just demolitions. She's using a pyrotechnic method because we couldn't get explosives into northwest Syria, but could use pyrotechnics to destroy items of explosive hazard that we found. The challenge there was politics as well, and the funding situation. As I said, donor fatigue was hitting, and I actually had to plan a closure and redundancy of that program. We did turn it around and secured some private fundraising, which has kept the program viable in the long term. But it was not a pleasant experience. So I was facing burnout from quite a few years overseas. And burnout's not uncommon in the humanitarian sector. The intensity of the work, the pressures, the lifestyle. It's I found myself, pretty tired, and I was at a bit of a crossroads. I was considering a sabbatical to take some time to think what I wanted to do next. When Halo dangled me the carrot of the position of country director in Ukraine. And I believe we make quite a lot of life choices either in pursuit of or retreat from romantic relationships. And for me, it was definitely the latter. So I had a serious relationship that ended, and I was on my own thinking, right, well, I've got this opportunity. Why not? Let's go to Ukraine. And as I said at the beginning, the sales pitch was, steady operations, some HR management, cultural issues. You'll provide a bit of, new, fresh, dynamic leadership. Security situation, that's fine. That tension's existed for years. You'll be split between Kyiv and Kramatorsk. And a friend reminded me the other day when at the time I said to her the plan, and I said, quote, "I'm really looking forward to a relatively relaxing year in a big established program, a super cool and interesting Eastern European city." Now, I was not wrong about Kyiv being a super cool and interesting city, but relaxing year ahead was not what I had ahead. But so I started in Ukraine in November 2021, and this is the team I inherited. About 430 Ukrainian staff split across Kramatorsk, Mariupol, and Cherokee, which is in Luhansk region, right on the Russian border. A strong established program. And this was November 2021 in the Donbass. We had a Dutch ambassador visit to a minefield to see where Dutch government funded teams were working. So I think you can see here it was incredibly cold. The Donbass is in winter, a biting cold. And with the Dutch ambassador, we had lunch afterwards in Severodonetsk, which is now sadly largely destroyed by Russian forces. And around that same time, I visited teams in Bakhmut as we were closing up for Christmas stand-down period. And whilst security tensions were increasing at that point, none of us anticipated what would be Bakhmut's tragic fate. This was December 2021. This was back in Kyiv with my finance team for a team Christmas party. And boy, do those Ukrainian women know how to drink. They could give us Scots a run for money. So that was a fun night out. But it was somewhat surreal at that point. The atmospherics, this building tension, the international, diplomatic community, the media frenzy around when, is Russia going to invade, and then the actual troop buildup on the Russian border. So it was unpleasant because you had this sort of cognitive dissonance between fun experiences like this with this rather terrifying backdrop or prospect of things and of a Russian invasion. So I went home for Christmas. The program had closed down. Went home for Christmas with most of our international staff. Did the same. We came back in early January, and at this point, the pressure cooker was intensifying. getting regular messages from family and friends back home. Are you okay? Shouldn't you be leaving? Is Putin going to invade? We're concerned. I probably didn't help my family's concern by just replying with WhatsApp pictures of the flat whites and the cocktails I was still drinking in Kyiv in January, because, healthy coping mechanisms when things get tense. So Halo didn't resume operations in the east at that point. So we pulled back international staff to Kyiv. And I should point out that there's 430 staff. They're all locals to that area. They're from the east. But we continued and intensified our contingency planning for a worst case scenario, obviously hoping it wouldn't materialize. So we closed our bases. We packed up kit. We removed all Halo branding because since the 2014 conflict and Halo's start of work in Ukraine, we've been subject to disinformation from Russia about being agents of the West, teaching people to lay landmines as opposed to actually clearing them. We were wrapped up in that, so we didn't. It was a security concern for our staff to be associated if there was a Russian invasion. And that's a hard thing to do as a manager when you want to say you're there to support your staff, but also we don't know if we can support you, and the best thing you can do is burn your Halo clothing and run. And the other challenge we had was not wanting to scaremonger or suggest to staff that we had more information than was available. I had connections to embassies and diplomatic channels, but nothing more really than open source and what was otherwise openly available. So we didn't want to scaremonger and spook the horses, so to speak. But by early February, things really were turning. And that was the point when US and UK travel advice to UK and US nationals in Ukraine was get out. And so at that point, I sent non-essential international staff home. And the reason is Halo isn't an emergency response organization, and often in times of crisis, having the expats there can create more problems, and the national staff feel this obligation to support, to extract them. Whereas if you can get them out earlier and support from afar before things stabilize, or at least you have an understanding of what's going on. So we pulled out non-essential staff so that we weren't a distraction to our Ukrainian colleagues. But myself and two of my senior management team, two British colleagues, we did stay in Ukraine, but headed to Lviv. What we saw at the time as a bit absurd, but a sort of notional symbolic presence that we were still on Ukrainian soil. We weren't completely abandoning our Ukrainian colleagues. We had no means to get them out at that stage. They had no desire. A lot of them had no desire to. No, nothing's going to happen. It's fine. We've had this for years. We're staying put. Thank you very much. Our family, our lives, our homes are in the east. So being there on Ukrainian soil. But as I said, it was a bit absurd because the west of Ukraine feels a million miles away from the Donbass, but nonetheless, we were there. And that was an even more surreal experience because Lviv, it since became an international hub for diplomats and aid agencies. But at the time, we were one of the few internationals in Lviv, which is, by the way, an incredible city. It's architecturally stunning, historically fascinating, great restaurants, great coffee culture. And we were stuck in an Airbnb, going out to eat nice food, drinking nice coffees, waiting for war to break. The Lvivites are quite hip and trendy, and so we did stick out like a sore thumb. We called ourselves Team Rab with our matching, good hardy Brits we were with our outdoor gear to brace the Ukrainian winter, but just maybe not the most trendy by Ukrainian standards. From there, we continued our contingency planning, and we were at a point proactively pushing couldn't push, but actively encouraging our staff that they needed to think about heading to safer locations. But as I said, many of them were somewhat blasé. They had endured the threat of Russia for years. They were refusing to leave, and we couldn't compel them. Then, of course, on the 24th of February 2022, the worst happened. And I'll never forget the call I received from my Ukrainian colleague, Bogdan, who's our liaison manager, extremely loyal, committed, brilliant individual. And he called me about, I think it was about 5 a.m. in quite broken, frantic English, saying, "Mhairi, it started, the bombing has started, Russia's invaded." And Bogdan, who was a military reservist, hence his role for us as a liaison officer to help us get access and secure approvals and permissions to work. But he was part-time military. He packed his bag and went straight off to fight. And he continued to support Halo throughout this early stage whilst he was involved in fighting. He was in the battle for Hostomel Airport. He would maybe lie low and go out of comms for a little while, but he maintained contact with us even when he was on this active duty, supporting us remotely with his connections, information, contacts to help other people, other staff members get out of the East. He was injured in that battle, thankfully not gravely, and he's truly a remarkable individual. So upon receiving that call from Bogdan, my two colleagues and I got into our packed car. It was our plan. We had this contingency. If war breaks, until we know what's going on, we need to cross the border and be in relative safety so that we can be in a better position to help. So we drove immediately to the Polish border and had a 12-hour wait. Buzzing with adrenaline, but also concern for our staff on the other side of the country. And at that point, Halo actually had a fleet of about 100 vehicles in the East, and our contingency plan was to allow staff to take the keys to the car. We'd assigned someone who could open up the key box. People could take their cars with their families and get out. So we were sitting in the 12-hour queue at the border, concerned for our staff on the other side of the country, fueled on adrenaline, coffee, nicotine, junk food, and surprisingly pizzas, when we managed to find at the border a very entrepreneurial Ukrainian individual who had a pizza kiosk. And we eventually we crossed into Poland. This was about midnight, drove through the night, and we hopped on a flight from Krakow to get back to the UK just to regroup. An intense experience, but nothing compared to that of many millions of Ukrainians who had unspeakable ordeals getting out of the most affected areas that were under direct attack. And many people, we heard the stories of people taking days to get out. So we were relatively lucky in our evacuation. The days after that were all a bit of a blur. I was initially at Halo's headquarters in Wilton, so they have an office in southwest Scotland, but also in the south of England. And there we, with Halo senior leadership, it was crisis management, planning, but it was total, it was the fog of war, the chaos of what's going on. So my main priority at that point was understanding the whereabouts and status of our staff, and doing what we could to help them remotely. And that was the big challenge. There wasn't necessarily a lot we could do to help at that stage. It was really tough knowing that, we were there at the end of the phone, but not always able to concretely help. But that being at the end of the phone and being that support at least was something. So that was my main priority. But obviously strategic objectives and mission of the mission of the organization had to be protected. And I think crises bring out the best and worst in people in organizations. It became quite a tense time internally. My dealings with my senior leadership did clash on quite a few occasions. I did challenge a lot of certain decisions that were being made at the top level. I learned a lot from that process and probably paid a bit of price in my professional reputation along the way. Challenging the establishment was not always easy, a real test of standing true to my values. But I feel I had my own integrity, at stake, and I wouldn't have been doing my job properly, my job as country director for 400 plus staff in Ukraine, if I wasn't prioritizing their safety. I went north from Wilton. I then went north to my mum's in Edinburgh for a short while, and I remember just a crazy schedule of crisis management meetings, and this, it was all a blur. I remember getting to my mum's and was so exhausted from the come down of the adrenaline sort of high, and then getting to somewhere safe. I got really, really sick, like the worst bout of flu, just because my body was finally able to rest. But yeah, like I said, that was nothing compared to the ordeal of what staff were going through in country. And at that point, well, Halo had a base in Mariupol of about 30 staff. A handful managed to escape in the very early days, but others weren't so lucky and endured bombardment over the several weeks. And that was a really tough time, because we had, we were in safety, but had intermittent comms with our colleagues who were just enduring the worst, and often sending sort of prophetic messages of, well, thanks for your support if you don't hear from me again. And so that feeling of helplessness at that moment was profound. Thankfully, most of the staff made it out of Mariupol, but sadly, we did lose a couple in that time period. We had a base of about 50 staff in a place called Cherokee in the Luhansk region, right on the border. And that area was very quickly taken by Russia. It didn't suffer the bombardment that was seen then in Mariupol. It's a slightly tricky region. It is slightly more Russian leaning, and there is, complicated politically. And it became very difficult to actually communicate with our staff. As I said earlier, Halo's perceived reputation, or Halo's reputation in within Russian circles of being, espionage agents of the West, meant that our staff were unwilling to communicate with us. So we were struggling to get updates on how they were. And subsequently, some staff were questioned for their work with Halo. At this point, and this was about early March, we set up in the unpronounceable Polish city of Rzeszów, which spelt with an RZESZOW, which was proved a lot of sniggers because it became the most international city all of a sudden out of the blue, since become a hub of UK and US military. And at that point, all the aid organizations were setting up response from there. And it's from there that our staff, so at that point, obviously Halo's core work was suspended. We still had all this workforce and all these assets, including a lot of vehicles. And it's incredible that it was more the initiative came at the grassroots level from our staff to start transporting aid using Halo vehicle, filling up. So this is in the West, filling up with humanitarian supplies, driving east, coming back and doing that run. A lot of our staff were needing that purpose whilst, they didn't have their normal day job. They felt the need to do something. So this, we started in Poland, as I said, and then in mid-March, we drove back into Ukraine, into Lviv, with a couple of colleagues, and that was where the UN agencies had set up in one of the main hotels there, and it becomes a sort of strange circus. It's not uncommon in conflict crises responses. You get this weird melting pot of UN workers, spooks, and aid workers who are working like crazy, intense environment, highly stressful, curfews, alcohol bans. That didn't stop the parties though, and it becomes a weird circus of the aid world. It's a slightly unsavory, strange aspect of that world. But while that was happening in Lviv, the horrors of Russia's occupation were unfolding, and that was the battle for Hostomel Airport, and then the horrors of what we've seen in Bucha and Irpin were taking place. But by mid-April, with the rapid retreat of Russia from their positions surrounding Kyiv, it was crack on, get back to Kyiv, and it was a strange sort of whiplash of reeling from the evacuation, and then right, engines on, get back into Kyiv, and that's from there we set up and re-established our operations, because there was an immediate need for mine clearance already, with people returning and attempting to get back to normal life. There were civilian accidents happening, and so we were back to Kyiv. This was a visit I did in that stage to Bucha. So this is very early on in April, and Bucha is very attractive, quite chic sort of commuter belt for Kyiv, and I've been there subsequently on multiple visits when we had teams then working in the area, but this early visit was really quite hard hitting. The man in the centre there is Bogdan, who had come back from the front, from active fighting duty, and was supporting as we had a CEO visit at that time. And that was ended up being quite a lot of my work was VIP handling, and it's the part of the aid sector that I was less comfortable with and often find myself in, was chaperoning and what we used to call the pony show. Because as soon as you have a VIP, everything becomes a bit of a theatrical display. But that was an early visit to Bucha. This is just 45 minutes east of central Kyiv, around Brovary. These were accidents that were already happening. So this is an agricultural land, and the tractor you see here hit an anti-tank mine that had been left. This was a family, I think all survived, but the driver lost both legs. But similarly, they hit an anti-tank mine driving just along a dirt track road between different bits of the village. This chap named Vadim was driving his truck that you see behind him along a dirt track road. His rear wheel hit an anti-tank mine, and miraculously he survived. He was ejected out of his vehicle, largely down to the fact he wasn't wearing a seatbelt. So we don't mention that for general health and safety, as I was trying to, make sure that my teams out and vehicles were always wearing their seatbelts. But he survived largely thanks to the fact that he wasn't wearing one. He survived without a scratch, but others are not so lucky. So we set up a base, a new operational base in a city, so sort of part of the urban sprawl of Kyiv, a city called Brovary in the northeast. We eventually managed to find it was an old shoe factory, which is what you see behind those walls, that we sort of converted into a logistics hub and an operational base for our teams. Before that, though, we set up in a hostel, which we then used to house staff that were still trying to get out of the east of the country. So essentially, so we received them there and allowed them to stay. And staff at that point, it was very clear a lot were going through tremendous trauma. A large part of my work at that time was engaging with donors to maintain the support, because we're obviously not producing any work or outputs, and we were reliant on donor government grants to keep paying the salaries of these people, and that in itself was a lifeline for them. We also established a psychosocial support program of counselling for our staff. I mean, mental health, I think, is still a taboo in this country up to a point. In Ukraine, it's even more so. The cultural barriers that we did make progress in breaking down, to offer that much needed support to our staff. And then we provided financial support for staff to relocate, an equivalent of 3 months rent, to pay, a deposit on a flat to move, to continue working for us. So there was a lot of work going on behind the scenes. And donors were largely supportive, sympathetic. It's just with donor government grants, there's less flexibility on budget. So there was a lot of communication to explain what we were planning to do with the money. This is the skyline of Brovary, which is a typical Ukrainian sort of Soviet block, where a lot of our staff were, then renting and moving to, and this was their new home. And the challenge we had at that stage was being empathetic to our staff, supporting them, but at that point having a program to run, and in getting teams back out to work where there was now a new need or an urgent need, and maintaining that operational technical rigor. The safety standards, obviously, in mine clearance is paramount. So maintaining that whilst also showing compassion and empathy for a workforce that was undergoing enormous trauma. So really, I describe it as building the airplane whilst we were flying it, supporting this traumatized workforce, recruiting, training, expanding a program, running safe operations all the time. So by the time I left the role in March of this year, I had 700 staff. And there are challenges enough in normal times of having that many employees. And that's what I did find. And sometimes that's where we got the funny, we have to find humor in the challenging circumstances, but people will still be people, whether there's war or no war. So dealing with HR issues ended up being consumed a lot of my time. The usual challenges of what people get up to. I decided to include this picture for the Botergarten Golf Club audience, and you might be here this evening. This was a very surreal experience. I joined one of our teams on a survey task, so precursor to conducting any mine clearance. You send out a survey team that goes and interviews local communities that have been affected by the conflict, to understand where is the explosive contamination, where was the mine laying, and build up a picture of a more accurate picture of the scale and type of contamination, and then to help prioritize. So it's interesting work. It's a lot of drawing up maps before clearance teams then come in. So I went out with a survey team, and they'd been assigned this task west of Kyiv to the golf course. The golf course that Russian troops had occupied. There were some defensive mines laid on the course, and the clubhouse, which you see here, had been used as a base. I think you just see in the center of the picture a golf caddy, and as we were walking around picking up golf tees, it was completely bonkers. It was a surreal day. Sad to say that was not considered a high priority humanitarian task. So the golfers of Kyiv will not get back to their safe golf anytime soon. We weren't going to assign our teams there, but maybe someday. But yeah, it shows just the juxtaposition of war with the everyday. So this is one of these survey teams at work. This was towards the end of my time in the role. This was in the south in Mykolaiv. So in November of last year, when the Ukrainian army liberated Kherson, that opened up the Mykolaiv region for us to work because it was no longer within artillery range. So whilst there's obviously the pervasive threat across the country of missile strike, we wouldn't be sending our teams anywhere within close range of artillery. So obviously November, when Kherson was liberated, it was an opening up of space for us to work in, and Mykolaiv was was occupied for some time and was really devastated by the Russian occupation. And so you see some houses here in a village with a position dug in front. This was a river. The holes with the red spray paint around them were where anti-tank mines were laid. So the Ukrainians were on the other side. Russians held this position, and it was to stop an advance from the Ukrainian army. So we were clearing anti-tank mines here. A lot of these tasks. So I left in March, April time. A lot of these tasks, and subsequently with the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam, were washed up and creating further complexities for clearance. This was some of the teams at work. So this is an anti-tank mine clearance task. So this is where the importance of survey work to ascertain what threat type. So it was confirmed there was no anti-personnel mine, hence people could walk across the land. And so that was where what's called a large loop detector is used to detect these metal anti-tank mines. But obviously, when there is a presence or a threat of anti-personnel mines, it becomes a lot more painstaking, and it's square meter by square meter that you see across this agricultural land here. And like I said at the beginning, it's painstaking, boring, painstaking, hard work. It's outdoors in the elements. It's down on hands and knees, which is what you see here, because every signal that's detected with a metal detector is a potential mine. Therefore, the response is to excavate, so going back a certain distance and digging down to then dig alongside so that you're not coming on top of the potential mine. Obviously, this was some summertime, I think maybe springtime, come winter when the frost comes, it comes a point where it's just not feasible. The productivity is so poor because of the hard ground. So yeah, blooming hard work. These were a couple of pretty hardy ladies. On the left is a lady who was remote. So she was an operator of a remote vegetation cutter, which is essentially like a big grass cutter with a games console, and she would be standing at a safe distance behind protective works. And we were using methods like that to detect tripwire. So a big part of Halo's work is finding that, well, pushing for efficiencies and technical advancements to. It's a tricky balance between obviously the safety of staff combined with pressures to be as efficient and quick and speedy as possible. So that was one of the methods, this remote vegetation cutter. The lady on the right, she used to work for a production company in Kyiv as a script writer for Ukrainian soaps. And obviously that work sort of dried up a bit, and it was her calling. She wanted to do something to support her country. And we found, that was when we were recruiting, that was what motivated a lot of people, was maybe not the army, but I can at least do something to support my country. And there are countless examples of everyday Ukrainians doing that kind of work. I show this because this is not an uncommon picture in Ukraine, but also more broadly in the mine action world, of being the only women in the room. This was a handover ceremony. So this was tasks we'd finished clearing in August of last year. And the process, there's a handing over, we do the paperwork to declare we'd cleared to certain depth and what areas. And then the landowner on the far left receives and signs and accepts and acknowledges that. And then we had representatives from the military and the local authorities. As I said, not uncommon to be the only woman in the room. Definitely had some frustrating moments in this world. And to be honest, I got quite used to the overt sexism in more conservative cultures. I'd lived in Egypt. I was pretty thick-skinned, was used to that, and you could often just laugh it off, and it was fine. I think what I found the bigger challenge was the more insidious sort of unspoken sexism, more within the organisation and within, the sector I was working in, amongst supposedly progressive Western individuals. And I think there's a prevailing mentality. It's not unique to the organisation I worked for, so I don't want to completely throw them under the bus, but it's particularly acute there. This prevailing mentality that men are competent until proven otherwise, and women are incompetent or at least weak and they're not entirely fit for the job until proven otherwise. So I did find my career in this world was quite a constant battle, having to prove myself, frequently being questioned and undermined. I definitely wasn't the chosen leader to be leading a large-scale program in the aftermath of the Russian invasion, so that's for sure. But had to find the wins when I got them. This is the Canadian Foreign Minister, Mélanie Joly, and a highly orchestrated and staged picture of all the powerful women that we wanted to demonstrate to her and to Canada, because Canada is a big advocate of feminist foreign policy. And so we have a team, we had our resident Canadian, Jasmine, on the right, who was wheeled out for the Canadian visit to talk Canadian. And then we had some pretty inspiring, pretty badass ladies from the east of Ukraine. And yeah, that was a fun visit, but often these visits became a bit of a sort of media circus and a political circus. There we go, a bit more gender balance. That's great. This was the German Foreign Minister, Annalena Baerbock, who came with a huge entourage, and obviously on a minefield where there's quite pressing safety considerations, that requires a lot of orchestration. She had a lot of close protection, fair enough, and the Ukrainians really put on a big show of that. Didn't help that it was absolutely bucketing with rain. We have warned her staffers that the visit will be in an active minefield in agricultural areas, so dress appropriately, wear good footwear. That message seemed to have been lost on her staffers, one of whom arrived in bally pumps. I managed to dodge a UK foreign minister visit that took place shortly after I left the role. But I did have the pleasure actually of meeting on a number of occasions and having some really interesting interaction with the UK ambassador, or former, so she's since just left her position, Ambassador Melinda Simmons. And she's been a really great role model. She's a woman of integrity and real grit. I have a lot of respect for her. And I think she had, in a small way, a sort of similar path to mine. She didn't necessarily sign up to be at the epicenter of the biggest conflict in Europe since World War II, and dealing with UK support for Ukraine, which was, on such a scale as it is. So, and all this attention. So really, but a really inspirational woman. I did meet. I did have the pleasure of hosting two Tory MPs who were our ambassadors for Halo. So on the left, the two gents there, you have Anthony Magnal, and on the right, David Mundell. Now, when I was told by my HQ, so we've got a visit coming, you'll be hosting two Tory MPs, I must confess I did groan a little and go, not another visit, two Tory MPs, seriously. I had to eat humble pie, and actually they were extremely engaged, empathetic, interested, and their support, it's not tangible, but they go back to Parliament and then talk about what they've seen, and it becomes real for the policymakers, and the allocation of funding to aid, to really crucial, important humanitarian aid. So organizations like Halo really need advocates like them. That visit, we took them to a Halo risk education session. So as well as the actual clearance work, we did a lot of community, going into schools, teaching kids about the dangers of explosive hazards. And this was a pretty powerful, and I found it quite hard-hitting visit. So this is the headmistress of Bucha School. So she had 1,000 children. She was there in Bucha throughout the Russian occupation. She lost a few of her pupils along the way, and her brother is a colonel in the Russian army. And it was remarkable, these two men on the right, completely different background, worlds apart, and they actually, she felt something and connected, and we were working through some brilliant interpreters there, and she was spilling her heart out because obviously this was just such angst and, well, more just existential trauma that, how could she conceive her family, her brother represents a country and an army that's committing what they did in Bucha. So that was yeah, there were some tears that day. I think I mentioned the media circus, and I fully understand the need to keep the spotlight and the need for the media. It was not my preferred. It wasn't the part of the job that I liked the most. I had to get quite used to it quite quickly because whilst I'd had some Halo training, some media training, the suggestion was that maybe once a quarter I'd have to do a media appearance, something like that. And Halo's work, for good reason, became very high profile, and I became a useful face of the organisation. Now, my first appearances on television and the likes, I was somewhat terrified, but by the end I was so busy and also so used to them that I barely batted an eyelid. And I think on one occasion, my media officer colleague in HQ had failed to tell me that my interview with Deutsche Welle was not, in fact, for a written article, but would be a live broadcast on the TV channel. So thankfully, when I joined this team, I think it was a Teams call, I had 5 minutes before I was due on air. So I ran into my colleague's office and shouted, I said, I need some Halo branded clothing and a hairbrush, and returned to conduct the interview. Which my dad tells me was a good one. I met some interesting characters within the media circuit. You might recognise this chap, John Sweeney, the former BBC journalist, Panorama, and he's a huge advocate for Ukraine, and a bit controversial in that he's crossed the line from journalism into advocacy, which is fine, but I think he ruffles some feathers in the journalist world. But he's a great individual, and I met him in a bar in Kyiv. So I managed to get an invite to his book launch. His book's very good, Killer in the Kremlin. I would recommend it. But yeah, so I was meeting characters like him in the bars of Kyiv. This became a very familiar mode of travel, which was the sleeper train crossing Ukraine from Poland into Ukraine. And I actually grew to love it because it was guaranteed early night. We'd get on I think it was about 11 o'clock, and would put out my lights, get tucked up in bed and not be bothered until 6 in the morning. Others didn't like it so much. It's pretty bumpy, a rickety ride, but incredible that so Ukrzaliznytsia is the Ukrainian national rail company, and they have kept the country running. It really shows up the UK rail system. Ukrainians are the masters of good comms. If you want to laugh, follow Ukrzaliznytsia on Twitter. They do some pretty funny posts, including one that I think said, number of missiles brought down upon Ukraine, X thousand, trains on time, 96%. I felt like adding a line, beat that British Rail. So it was familiar, and I grew to love it. This is some of the realities of last winter, and as we approach this winter with the Russian missile strikes on critical national infrastructure, we'll see how it plays out this year. But living in an apartment in Kyiv, it's difficult to rig up generators within an apartment block, so I got quite used to trusty little camp stove and candles and a glass of wine. And walking the streets, got used to having my head torch in my pocket. It was actually fine in Kyiv, out in Brovary, where it was an urban sprawl and no street lights, and a lot of people not wearing high-vis things, and so driving was in the dark was pretty unnerving. But that became an everyday reality. And then yoga, which was my sort of sanity saver throughout. But yeah, yoga by candlelight because I had to. This was an attempt, a somewhat naive attempt of mine to instill a bit of normality and routine. So I bought a very nice Ukrainian bike. And Kyivites will fool you into thinking it's a bike-friendly city. It's definitely not. There's lots of hip, trendy Kyivites, Uber Eats, delivery cyclists, but it's not a bike-friendly city. Lots of hills, which I'm familiar with, obviously, from this part of the world, but more the cobbles and very few bike paths and quite erratic driving. So I brought my Ukrainian bike back, and it's now out in the open roads of Perthshire. I'm much happier, I think. This was, I walked into one of my team's offices around Christmas time last year, and I didn't know whether to laugh or cry when I saw this, but I think this sort of exemplifies the dark, macabre humor of a lot of Ukrainians, but their resilience. And I think in the trying times, you've got to keep finding that humor. Without that, what's the point? But yeah, this was there were a lot of giggles when the boss walks in to discover the new Christmas tree that the Ukrainians had put up. And then another photo to exemplify the defiance and resilience of Ukrainians in the face of adversity. This was so I've since been back in my new work post Halo, and this was in a town called Biela Sirkva, just south of Kyiv, along the river, and it's summertime at the beach, and you wouldn't, war, people going about, rightly so, having a great time, drinking beers, swimming in the river. I'm not sure I'd swim in that river, given the potential toxicity levels from other hazards, but yeah, it's pretty remarkable and admirable. I took a lot of strength from my colleagues throughout this experience, and I had, there was a few occasions I had to remind myself that I can leave. These people don't have a choice, and in the case of a lot of my male colleagues, they really don't have a choice. They can't go anywhere. They're barred from leaving their country right now. So I think it was getting strength from them that I just threw myself into it, dealt with the challenges as they came along, and yeah, it was thanks to a brilliant team, some of whom you see here, that kept me on the straight and narrow. So I left Halo I left the role in March, left Halo in April. And the aid sector is quite an all-encompassing, consuming lifestyle. It's definitely a lifestyle choice. And Halo itself is a particular breed within that world. And so I've taken a step back from, whilst I continue to support in a different way I like to think. I'm not in the aid world anymore, for now at least. Still working on and periodically in Ukraine, but trying to get a bit more balance in life post that experience. But yeah, my time in Ukraine has undoubtedly shaped me, and lost a lot of it. Hard and challenging experiences are ones that I'll definitely carry with me for the rest of my life. I'll stop there. I realise I've spoken a lot.
Thank you so much. Wow. It's a very powerful, I was going to say story, but it's more than a story. It's an account of a really significant part of our history, isn't it? That's still ongoing. So thank you so much for that. And what came through to me was that the emotion in your voice still. You clearly has left an indelible mark and influence on you. And I think that it's tremendous what you've done. You've clearly grown through it, but the impact that you've had through the teams that you've been working with is just splendid. It's phenomenal. Questions? I mean, I've got loads, but if anybody wants to have one. Yes.
Just like to ask that out of your thousands of employees, what kind of percentage is it that are doing, I see them just quite literally with a little minesweeper? Are these people who are just from all backgrounds, and what's the kind of percentage of these people on the ground doing that to all your other staff that needed to support all these things?
That's a good question. It's I think we're about 80% operational staff, 20% support. So that was management, finance, administration, donor relations. And then of the team's operational staff, there's management within that. But yeah, there's a large bulk of the workforce. And I think so we would take Halo's model globally is taking people from zero background and training them up. And it takes about a month to train a D minor. It doesn't require previous skills or high level of education, and that's where in a lot of these communities and other contexts, working in Syria, Somaliland, Cambodia, it's people that have got minimal, barely literacy, but that's often a prerequisite to read a safety protocol, and have discipline, good physical health, but really there isn't a need for any background in this kind of work.
And then is there a pool of experts who come in from armies or bomb disposal? Do you pool them in from local regions where you are, or do you have a pool of them as well?
Yeah, so that was, that's where a lot of the international staff come into play, and a lot. So in the explosive ordnance disposal, it was largely ex-military that come from a bomb disposal background and moved into the humanitarian world. From the clearance perspective, it's people that had worked within the organisations internationally for a number of years. But obviously the aid world, there's a push, a need to shift that balance between expat and localization. It's a big theme, big topic across the aid sector, and Halo's doing a lot of good work to spot talent from a D minor that walks in the door and does the basic D minor training, and then you spot the potential to put them on accelerated programs so that they can go on and manage teams, and then potentially grow and move internationally within the organization. So there's a lot of work going on to promote that kind of thing, which is much needed.
Can I just jump in? While other people might be thinking of questions. What we're doing tonight is use all the money from the missions and any money you might choose to donate in various boxes before you escape out of the door is going to go to a charity that Mhairi is nominating that's based in Lviv, and it's Divchata.
Girls in,
yeah. So could you just say a little bit about that charity?
Yeah, it's originally they supported women and girls initiatives in Ukraine, so supporting women who've been victims of sexual violence and that type of project. And then with the invasion, they sort of shifted to just supporting humanitarian work more broadly. I think the likes of Halo, there's a need for fundraising, but they get a lot of big government donor grants. So for public fundraising, that kind of support is really crucial for these grassroots organisations that are doing a lot of provision of aid. So they're sending food parcels to people in need. They're sending basic supplies, sanitary towels, all this kind of thing for people who are in tough conditions across the country. So it'll support a grassroots organisation that still has women and children at its core as well.
Thanks for that. And I think it's just nice to think that we can do a little bit, tiny contribution that we'll make, but just something that we can do. So this is an extra talk. We would normally have 9 talks in a season. This is the 10th one. So the hall kindly allowed us to use the hall for nothing, and all the money will go to that charity. And I think, let me say, just a nice thought that we can connect with the work that Mhairi has been doing there. Other questions? Yeah.
How do you sort of practically look for mines? I mean, the Russians obviously don't tell you where to put them. So what is the searching process? How do you search for them?
That's where the survey work is really crucial. So it's going into communities that endured the occupation of the military, or saw what was happening, and are able to give information. And so it's a case of gathering together all available sources. Sometimes maps, we did find, on occasion do find maps. We don't rely on them solely because they're not necessarily reliable, but that's one source. But it's local informants, it's accidents. So sadly, that is an indicator. Well, there's a tractor that was blown up in that field, and then you go and work around that to establish what happened in that surrounding area. So it's these survey teams that are trained in the sources of information and going out and speaking to community. So it's quite hard to sell to. Well, I think donors would get it, but it's a precursor. It's just really important work before to establish where the contamination is and what type. And it's a really big job because the country. It's important to have that baseline survey, and that's what's going on at the moment in Ukraine in the mine action world. Is creating a database of everywhere that's contaminated, so that then they can prioritise and establish what needs to be done most urgently.
So you expect to be going on for a few years then?
Decades. Obviously, it all depends on funding, but there's often figures spouted that for every day of conflict, it would be X days of clearance. It's really hard to pinpoint. It depends on the nature of the warfare, but given the intensity of fighting and given the geographical scale of the country, it's definitely years ahead.
It's slightly off the track we've been talking about, but I can't imagine how an individual can go there to a piece of ground on which you found there's some mine and actually sort it out. Could you just describe one particular type of operation, how a person would actually get that done?
Yeah, let me go back to picture because it helps. So it would, it's systematic. It's square meter by square meter. So that deminer will have, it's very, very rigorous drills. Going back a step, the survey team, if they confirm an area as hazardous, they will put up marking, no entry and danger mine signs around the area that's considered contaminated, and then you'd send deminers in, referred to as breach lanes, to sort of push in square meter by square meter with this very methodical process of sticks and marking sticks, and so you wouldn't step, you put your detector over square meter, then move your marking stick, do it again, move your marking sticks, and then, you've encountered a signal, place on the ground a chip, a red marker, very gently place it on the ground, and then there's a whole drill to go back and dig down, and so it becomes extremely mechanical, methodical, and can be painstaking.
Effectively, dig a trench around it, and then you sort of nibble away at it.
You wouldn't dig the trench. You would know that, say, this is your contaminated area. You wouldn't enter from it, but you would start these breach lanes, and then sort of like a grid to complete it. If you know the type of mines that have been laid, or there's a pattern of mine laying, you would search for the mine line. And then if you find that, you work, and then would have called a fade out, that you would clear a certain distance beyond the known mine line. But that's only when it was systematic mining. The problem in Ukraine is that the nature of Russia's occupation in many of these areas, it's often when they retreat that they would place, indiscriminately. So there was defensive mine belts, and then it was just, right, well, we're leaving now, we're going to cause as much pain and havoc as we leave. So, it's hard, it's not as methodical. There's no rhyme or reason in the laying, therefore it makes for challenging clearance. Well, then if you find the mine, it needs to be destroyed. Now, the challenge in Ukraine, the international operators didn't have permission to conduct explosive ordnance disposal. In other contexts, like I saw some of the photos I showed at the beginning, that's where you place a countercharge. So you do a controlled demolition to blow up the original explosive hazard. Challenge in Ukraine is the laws such that international operators didn't have licenses, and you can kind of understand if UK was facing a war, we wouldn't allow foreign operators to come and go, hey, you can start blowing up stuff here, and that's where this misconception about Ukraine, it's a sophisticated, developed country that legislation in place, and they've got the authorities come in and do the actual disposal bit at the end and clear up, but there's a whole whole amount of work that goes into actually finding the mines.
Do the detectors that you use give you the depth of the mine?
So international mine action, now we're getting technical. International mine action standards, it's to 15 centimetres. So that's, operators have to clear to a minimum of 15 centimetres, but that's generally where you stop or a bit, because beyond that, it wouldn't operate. There's no point putting an anti-personnel mine a metre below the soil because no one will activate it. So you calibrate detectors to a certain depth. And again, that's part of the survey work. You might discover along the way that they laid very deep mines, and so you have to change your depth. So there's a whole consideration about depth, but yeah, that's the more techie part, which I less au fait on. But.
Thank you.
Brendan.
I want to say thank you very much for coming to speak to us, first of all. I wondered, you showed a photograph where you had some ordnance on the surface, and I wondered if you found out about that by local people reporting it because of mishaps. But can you also do drone surveys or anything like that to make it safer for the
Yes, very much so. I will caveat that I am not a technical expert and it's not my area of expertise, but that was a big part of, in Halo, there's an R&D department that was looking at ways of innovation to support clearance. Drones we used, I used them in Abkhazia more just to get aerial footage of the site and just to mark progress. But they were, I know Halo was looking more in Angola, where it's, across large desert areas, you can look with infrared because where mines are laid, it's different soil temperature, and you can detect that through drone footage and then know where a mine line is. The drones are used in a number of ways in the mine action world. Just not an area I have expertise in.
But I've seen that. Thank you very much.
Clearly, the human element is absolutely vital. And from what you're saying, is it makes up a very sizable percentage of the demining. But for argument's sake, in that sort of scenario, do they ever use mechanical means? Because there are, I know the Americans have, for example, for demining in Afghanistan, if you will. They have pretty heavy duty equipment which they can run over. But it may not, of course, what I don't know is whether it will actually activate a personnel mine. I'm sure a tank mine will. But
mechanical assets are used a lot because it can make for much more efficient clearance. What we generally do is armor the bucket so that if there's an unplanned detonation, it's only the bucket that's destroyed, and then the cab would have to be completely armored so that the operator inside is protected. In Ukraine, because we got an influx of a lot of money, we were able to get purchasing lots and lots of excavators, and including remote controlled excavators, because that means you don't have to armor the cab, because the operators, like that lady we saw for a different method, they're behind, it's like a games console, it's, they're operating the excavator from a safe distance.
Mhairi, is it worth mentioning to your audience that in some parts of the world, rats are used?
No, because animals are used to detect mines, but not consistently. And I'm not speaking no longer in a Halo capacity. Halo didn't use any animals because too much like hard work. It requires a lot of training. You still need handlers. It's very technical, and you can employ local people and pay them a fair wage, and it costs that was the Halo line. And whilst I'm no longer Halo, I would agree with that approach.
Has anyone come up with a drone that could have a metal detector attached to it?
There's probably some prototype somewhere, but we used to. I'm not the R&D expert, but we used to have jokes at the sort of Bright Ideas Club of these crazy machines that were built, and it will be the answer to all mine clearance. That with a single machine you could clear millions of square meters a day. Often it's people with good engineering brains, but the terrain, the diversity of terrain type, the soil, that's perfect demining land because it's flat, it's a big open field, but that's not the norm really. So there isn't a sort of silver bullet of a machine like that.
Unless you and Duncan want to go away and develop something.
Yeah. And sorry, that wasn't to dismiss your question, but there probably is some idea out there, but yeah, it wasn't detectors on drones. I'm not convinced, but I'm not the R&D the engineering brain.
There's another one I know.
Just a quick one. Are all mines detectable, or is there like some plastic ones or things like this that you can't?
Very good question. There are a lot of minimum metal mines. Generally, you won't find a metal-free mine because the detonator, there's a tiny component to initiate the explosion. I think that's the case. But I know colleagues in Angola were struggling with the challenge of minimum metal mines because it requires a very fine-tuned detector because it's such a small metal component.
Can I? Oh, okay. Go on.
Typically, are your donors?
The donors, international governments, so Halo in Ukraine, funded by the UK government, the Dutch, the US, EU, the French, Norwegian, all Western nations. Prior to the Russian invasion in 2022, we had 8 donors, I think, and then it went to about 80 different grants. A lot of private foundations. Halo's funded now a significant chunk of money from the Howard Buffett Foundation. He's putting a lot of money into Ukraine. And so Halo's receiving a lot of funds from them. So Halo's funding is majority governments, and a very small fraction that is private or fundraising.
And is there a concern that if some of the governments reduce their support for the war in general, that would be more again?
Absolutely, and that was a lot of my work was about maintaining donor support. So it was engaging with diplomats in embassies in all of the contexts where I worked with Halo. It was trying to keep them on side. Sometimes that there's political decisions made that go beyond, but a lot. It was a big concern. Big concern just in the aid sector in general is the sort of boom and feast or famine, we called it. You'd either have all the money in the world, and in the case of Halo, we had this influx of funds, and a lot of the donors were saying, well, it needs to be spent this financial year. Well, that's great, but we can't scale up that quickly to spend. We've got to juggle, a handful of other grants. So it was a challenge, the challenge, it needs to maintain consistent levels of funding because it is a multi-year job ahead.
Chris, thank you.
How well are the staff paid? Are they expected to work in an area close to where they live, or if people have to move around the country to the areas where the mines are, do they get accommodation found for them, or how's it working? If you've got, as you finished up with over 700 staff, that's a lot of money. It's got to go out.
Yes, so staff salaries were was the biggest budget line, or is the biggest budget line on a demining programme. We would benchmark salaries against sort of, it depends on the country context, but a decent like agricultural worker or a factory worker to equivalency with a manual job, an unskilled manual job. Ukraine, the challenge is, it's also a very educated workforce, and so the other jobs, we were struggling to recruit because there's quite high salary expectations. But with deminers, it's a decent wage. In other countries, often the comparison we used was what would be a soldier salary, something like that. The second point to your question: do they work where they live? Work where they live. Yes, local recruitment was a big was a priority. Initially, that was quite hard because we had a displaced workforce that we'd moved to Brovary. But as we were expanding into new areas, it was the big push was to recruit in Kharkiv and Mykolaiv, because then you've got investment from local community that they know the land, they know the people, they know the connection, they have connections. But it wasn't always possible, particularly in Mykolaiv, it was really difficult to recruit locally. A lot of men, the challenge in Ukraine right now is with conscription. A lot of men were scared to go out and be seen and be visible, so we're just keeping their head down, not wanting to be potentially scooped up for conscription, and we couldn't get exemptions. We were lobbying for exemptions, but it's a tough ask. Yes, we're doing humanitarian work, important humanitarian work. You've also got a country at war that's they've got a conscription law. We didn't want we couldn't be getting around that, so that was quite a big challenge, and continues to be a big challenge.
And then just take a couple more. So Anne first, and then I come to you second.
Mhairi, I believe you speak several languages. What language were you using most? Was it English with all the staff you were working with, or did you have to use your?
I had grand plans to revive some very rusty Pidgin Russian when I started the job, and then war broke out and language learning sort of got deprioritized. So I could hustle. I don't speak any Russian or Ukrainian, but I had a very competent team of interpreters, really brilliant, and so used them to communicate with most staff. I mean, senior management, and that's a challenge in the aid world, right? Is that English becomes a prerequisite, but you might miss a lot of talent. So that was another initiative that we did, actually. I forgot to mention that. We rolled out English language classes as another kind of means of support to offer something for our staff. So yeah, English, I was a lazy international that was using an interpreter. Interestingly, Russian, so most of our existing staff were native Russian speakers because they're from the Donbass, and then moved when we relocated the program to Brovary and around Kyiv. It was more Ukrainian spoken, and then it became a clear political. It was really interesting to observe that hearing it more, and then having some of the existing Donbass staff feeling uncomfortable going into shops speaking Russian, and having to switch to Ukrainian, and then getting quite understandably upset that Russian is my language, it's not my country. So I had some interesting discussions with staff about that. But we had to officially all documents were in Ukrainian, but we because a lot of our staff, we actually offered Ukrainian lessons to some of our staff because that was an impediment to them continuing promotion, because they'd not, they'd learnt Ukrainian at school, but it wasn't the language they used. So.
Okay. Just take, come.
Did you lose any of your staff in the course of your work?
In the course of work, not during my time there. Hela's had an accident just last month in Mykolaiv. I know of it through friends, former colleagues. I don't know the details, but there was 3 staff involved in an unplanned explosion. One who sadly died of his injuries. The other 2 are will make a full recovery. It's very uncommon. Operational accidents, there's a high safety record and there's stringent safety protocols for a reason to prevent these accidents, but just they're just in the same way in a factory, you have protocols to stop accidents happening in a manufacturing factory, they still do because human error or circumstance. So, but not during my time, none during work, in a work context. We lost staff in Mariupol and a couple of staff who were conscripted and fighting.
Before I just wrap things up and thank Mhairi for this evening, can I just introduce Trish? Because Trish is it? Alex, sorry. It's been a long night. Is involved with a really worthwhile charity that's linked to Ukraine.
So we've been in Avonmore from our house. We've been collecting donations of clothing, medical supplies, bedding, food, everything that Ukraine possibly needs. At the start of the conflict, a charity was started up in Errol from the airfield with Maurice Leslie's donated a warehouse, and he's donated it for as long as it's needed. From that, Tash for Ukraine was born, and they have managed to get out to date 65 HGVs full of aid. They take it to the Polish border, where it's distributed by small charities to the front lines everywhere. If you follow them on Facebook, they actually show where all the donations are going, and they get feedback from where all the donations are going. We are a collection point for them, and my address is on the back of here as a collection point, and gives a list of all the collection points. They are one of the biggest people in the whole of Scotland and now Northern England who are still getting donations out. So pick up a leaflet. There's a list of stuff that they need, but that's not, if you find anything else that you think would be useful, we have had evacuation stretchers, we've had community nurses collecting, if things can't go back, if you've got an excess of medical equipment, nothing can go back, we take it. Outdate first aid kits. Yep, that doesn't matter, a bandage is a bandage in Ukraine. So this is a list. Since we've been doing it, we've probably filled enough to take 2 HGVs out to Ukraine. They regularly pick up from us, but at the moment we're struggling for space. If anybody has a garage or something that we can put stuff in boxes, we would be very grateful for that as well at the moment. Up to now, Mountain Warehouse have been very good to help us out, but they've kind of, I think...
They want the space.
Yes, yeah, so we've done very well. They come and pick up regularly from us, so it's not a huge amount of space that we need, but just so we've got a bit of space in our house. So if you'd like to help yourself to leaflet, if you want my telephone number, anything, just let us know.
Thanks for that. That's true.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks again, Mhairi. That's been a fantastic evening. I mean, that's some real insights. So I think first-hand experience that's come through, and I think we've got more. I felt more in touch and more engaged with the Ukraine than you ever get from just watching on the news. And however good the reportage is, I think that's just given us a real sort of sense of what actually is going on the ground. And it could go on for a long. I'm fascinated to know what it would be like going back into villages that have been liberated from the Russians, and what happens. So there's, you could sit here all night and have conversations, but I know you've got to be in London tomorrow. So thank you so much for finding the time, giving us the time, and giving us your insights. It's been wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.